Hello class. In this video I'm going to be going over some of the history of Western science, sort of how we got to where we are today. And so we'll be beginning with the roots in Judaism and in ancient Greece, and then very quickly moving up through the history of science to just kind of give you an overview of how events in the past have shaped our current understanding of the world. The first sort of scientific view, or at least history of science view, is that of ancient Judaism. And in ancient Judaism, it was generally understood that everything was governed directly by God, and this essentially makes science impossible. Because if God is directly controlling everything, there aren't any laws that sort of guarantee that things are going to be the same tomorrow as they are today, or that they'll be the same in the same places. We can't make these general theories and then come to conclusions. So God is very immanent in this view. God is in control. God cares about God's people. It doesn't really allow for the scientific enterprise that we have today. So while this still shapes our view of God in important ways, we have generally moved on from this view of God as directly controlling everything and not giving sort of any sense of control or creative capacity to nature. Our other set of intellectual forebears in the West is that of ancient Greece. And the two most prominent thinkers, the ones who wrote the most, are Plato and Aristotle. Socrates came first in ancient Greece, and Plato was his student. Plato actually wrote everything down. Socrates, as far as we know, never wrote anything down. And then Aristotle was the student of Plato. And Plato and Aristotle have very much affected the way that we view the world, and they viewed the world very differently. So Plato was a dualist about existence, meaning that there was a strong distinction between the material and the immaterial. And for Plato, the material was just a shadow of the immaterial. It was sort of this thing that we needed to get past to get to those things that were really important, which was the immaterial world, the world of forms, as Plato called it. And if you've taken a philosophy class, you probably know at least sort of the beginnings of that. As a result of this, Plato didn't care much about science. Plato was a mathematician. He cared about those things that sort of transcended the physical. He once gave a public lecture where he said, I'll be telling you truths about the universe, and people showed up and they were excited, and he just proceeded to write down mathematical formulas, because that was sort of as close to truth as he thought that he could get, at least in that setting. So very different from Plato is Aristotle. And for Aristotle, the physical is the primary. He doesn't deny that there are immaterial things, but for him, the physical world is the important stuff. And this resulted in him being a scientist. Aristotle famously would spend long amounts of time, for example, studying the way that turtles reproduced, or making meticulous notations about various plants and animals. So Aristotle is really the first scientist, the one who got this scientific thing going. And a really important part of Aristotle's scientific ideas was this Greek word entelechy, which translated means something like inner urging. And Aristotle wanted to say that within nature, within all matter, there was this inner urging to go towards a goal or an end or a purpose. So for Aristotle, everything in nature, humans as well as rocks and trees and animals, have a purpose, and they are tending towards that purpose. So a good example of this is Aristotle would want to say that an acorn has an entelechy in it to become an oak tree. It has this purpose in mind, and as long as the conditions are right, it will go towards that. And for Aristotle, his version of God was the ultimate purpose for everything in the universe. He called God the prime mover. God was what created change initially in the universe, and God sort of explained where everything was headed. So that's what gave everything in nature purpose, or in philosophical terms, gave it a teleology, a telos. So for Aristotle, there is a God of sorts, but God is not the creator, and God doesn't care about any individual. God in Aristotle's universe is sitting there thinking about himself, because he would think about the thing that's most perfect, which is him. And then all of nature is trying to become like God in some way. So for Aristotle, God is very transcendent, but he has nothing to do with our sort of day-to-day life. God is a feature of the universe that explains things about the universe, such as change, but God does not explain existence, and God does not sort of care about what we're doing in our daily lives. So we will see a synthesis of these two views in the next person we take a look at, Thomas Aquinas. So we now come to Thomas Aquinas, who was a medieval monk and is widely considered to be one of the most intelligent people to have ever lived. And I think he's one of the best examples of sort of combining this immanence and transcendence in a way that allows us to go out and investigate the world. So according to Aquinas, nature/creation, including us, have been given creative powers, and God is primary. God created everything, God sustains everything. Without God, everything would cease to exist. But God has given creation and humans some of God's self, some of God's ability to create things. So as humans, for example, we have a will. We can create decisions out of nothing. I would say because of the fact that we are made in God's image. And in Aquinas, God has a purpose for creation, and it's not sort of a vague purpose, but it's the purpose to bring everything together in glory to God. Everything was made for God, so our final purpose rests in God. It's in our best interest to become more like God, because that's why we're here in the first place. So as we worship God, as we become closer to God, we actually become more human, not less. So with Aquinas, God is immanent, God is transcendent, and we can do science, we can investigate the natural world, because the natural world is ordered. The natural world has its own processes that are regular and testable. Skipping forward in history quite a bit, we come to the Newtonian Revolution. And Isaac Newton discovered all sorts of really cool things about the universe, some universal laws, some ways that we can predict things that we couldn't have done before. And these were all wonderful things, but they came with some consequences, some sort of metaphysical assumptions that seem to accompany Newton's discoveries, sort of as we move forward in the history of science. So one thing that became sort of thought about, accepted by most people, was that the universe is a deterministic machine. Deterministic meaning that everything is already determined one way or another. We don't have free will, and if we had enough information and computing power, then we could predict everything that will happen in the future, and retroactively we could determine everything that had happened in the past. So sort of the universe is set, and it's just a machine that's sort of running out its program. There's no kind of human free will acting on it, and usually God is not acting on it either. You may say every once in a while God does a miracle, But really, God is there to explain why the universe is there in the first place. But God is generally not seen as active anymore in the universe in this kind of paradigm. So also matter slash creation now is acted upon. It doesn't have its own internal force. So going back to Aristotle, if we wanted to explain why a rock fell, for example, we would want to say that rocks and the things that make up rocks tend towards the center, because Aristotle thought the Earth was at the center of the universe. So the rock was moving towards its purpose by going down. Nowadays, we want to say that gravity is acting on the rock. The rock isn't doing anything itself, rather they're outside forces causing it to do things. And this is a serious change, and it leads to this picture that the universe is just this combination of dead matter and forces acting on that dead matter. There's no longer a purpose or a goal to creation. Rather, there's just random things happening at any given time. So this is a very different picture than the one that Aquinas thought about, and going all the way back to ancient Judaism, very different than that as well. So here, God created everything, God is powerful, but God isn't active in the universe, and the universe doesn't have its own creative capacities. It's just merely acting out a script that has already been set for it. Having briefly looked at the Newtonian revolution, we can now move on to modern day, which began with the quantum revolution. So this was in the early 1900s, and it led to the kinds of theories that you've probably heard about, at least in passing, like Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, etc. So in the early 1900s, late 1800s, scientists essentially thought that the task of science was complete. That all they needed to do was build better computing machines, gather more information, but that the theories were essentially set, that they understood the basic workings of the universe. Then a number of problems arose with those theories, and a paradigm shift occurred, and something totally new came onto the scene. So here are a few of the major differences between the Newtonian outlook and the new quantum outlook. In the Newtonian world, things were thought of as deterministic, that everything was determined by the current state of the universe. In the quantum world, it is thought that things are inherently not determined, that there's an element of randomness, that we can't know something, that's a feature of the universe, is that it's random. In Newtonian understanding, they thought that energy or motion could come in any quantity, and quantum mechanics showed that energy actually has sort of a lowest value, and that turned out to be very important in a number of ways. In Newtonian understanding of the world, waves and particles were different. Waves propagated out, just like a wave on a pond or whatever, and particles were definite. But in quantum mechanics, there came to be this understanding that everything has both wave and particle characteristics. So you and I have some wave parts to us, and when you get down to the very, very small, such as electrons, those characteristics become very pronounced and have very strange consequences that we'll take a closer look at. One consequence of this wave-particle duality is that location is no longer definite. With large objects, we have a pretty good idea of where they are, but with electrons, we can have little to no idea where they are. They could be sort of zipping around all over the place because of their wave nature. And this gets to one of sort of the fundamental differences, this distinction between epistemic and ontological ignorance. So the Newtonian camp in the Newtonian paradigm wanted to say that our ignorance about the world is just because we don't have enough information, we don't have big enough computers. But in the quantum world, they want to say that our ignorance is actually built into the universe, that there are certain things that we just can't know because of the wave particle duality of nature and other things. So this is interesting. Some philosophers think that this undetermined nature of the universe sort of leaves room for God to influence events or helps make sense out of free will, and we'll take a closer look at that later in the course. But now we will turn to a few other activities to show at least a little bit about this quantum strangeness, though do not be discouraged if you don't fully understand what's going on. In fact, be surprised if you do, because the best minds in physics seem to think that no one can really fully get their mind around these really strange things. But it's good to try and get somewhat of an idea of what's going on in those very small parts of the world and how they can affect the larger parts of the world.